100 years ago, people were sitting in a coffee shop reading the newspaper.
Right.
And now people are sitting in a coffee shop reading whatever news on a tablet or listening to it or watching a video. It still happens.
Right.
Maybe not as much mixed conversation as there once was. You can't go and hear a debate between two scholars in your local coffee shop.
Although we should bring that back.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vagrant Coffee HustleCast. So glad that you're still with us. Today we're going to be jumping in and talking about why coffee specifically. Lots of different businesses are out there and lots of different ideas, but we're going to get into why coffee is important for us. Now, before we get into that though, let's talk a little bit about what we're drinking today. So I went ahead and made us up some cappuccinos today. And in our cappuccinos, just like any other espresso drink, we use our Nomad blend. Our Nomad blend has been with us probably the longest of all the other coffees that we do. It's got tasting notes of peach and grilled fig, coconut, almond. It's got a really pleasant aftertaste. It's really great for a lot of our espresso beverages. Yeah. So I mixed that with about 6 ounces of milk, and we both like a little simple syrup thrown in there for some sweetness, but it's pretty good. So pick up some Nomad next time you're around any of our shops, or you can buy online at vagrantcoffee.com. Just click on, shop now and pick up a bag.
We'll send it right to your door.
Yeah. So why coffee?
That's a great question that I still get asked every day.
Yeah.
I suppose there's a lot of different businesses we could have started.
Yeah.
I've been in coffee for a very long time. So I guess there's kind of, I break it up in my mind, at least into two parts. Like, why did I get into coffee to start a business? And also, why did I get in coffee originally?
Well, why did you when was the first time you drank coffee?
So I grew up with a dad that drank 2 or 3 pots of coffee a day.
Nice.
And it was the good stuff. It was either in a blue can or a red can.
Nice.
If
it's canned, it's good.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up thinking coffee was terrible. And it was in college where I had my first coffee where I thought, hey, this is pretty good. You want to guess which coffee shop I might have been at? That would have been 2001.
Okay.
Their logo is green.
It sounds about right.
So Starbucks was the first time I honestly ever had a coffee where I was like, man, this is not just like garbage, freeze-dried, old grocery store canned stuff.
Yep.
And I mean, back in 2001, they were still using La Marzocco espresso machines. Yeah. It was still made by hand. They weren't so big that they could only buy the lower quality stuff, because you could, with however many stores they had then, they're still buying top tier stuff.
Yeah.
The problem they have now is they're so big, they can't, there's too much coffee that they need to get that top tier stuff. So I really, in college is when I realized that, hey, maybe coffee isn't as bad as I always thought it was.
Yeah.
And the problem I found was it's expensive. And so my getting into coffee was for the employee discount.
Nice.
That's what got me through college.
Nice. That's so fascinating. My first taste of coffee was also growing up with my dad, who he took us on to one of the military bases that we were at, and we went into, I don't remember it that well because I was super young, but I remember there was a pot of coffee and he let me try some, and I thought, this is the worst thing in the world. Why do people do this to themselves? And they do it a lot. And so I kind of swore off coffee for a long time. Every now and then I would have it, but only if I destroyed it with cream and sugar.
Right.
And then ironically, in college, I also decided to go to a specific kind of coffee shop and give that classic caramel macchiato a taste. And I thought, wow, this is pretty good. Like, this is very different than what I thought coffee was. And I thought, okay, well, let me keep doing this. Now, I switched eventually to thinking like, okay, let me try to drink black coffee because I don't understand it, but I feel like there's something there.
Yeah.
And I wasn't quite sure how to do it. So I went through the phase like a lot of people do of like drinking a lot of K-Cups.
Yeah.
And like ordering online to try to get different tastes.
Different flavors.
Yeah. And I was like, some I found at the time, I was like, okay, I can get down with this. I don't know what it is about it. But okay, let me go with it. And it kind of continued down that path until I started working in coffee, which for me was because I really liked the human interaction and when we were on people. And so when I started working in coffee, that was actually the first time I ever had several black coffees side by side to taste the differences between them. And that's when my eyes were really opened of like, oh, this is not at all like what I thought it was. And this is great because everything I had up to this point was just not as good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we chatted for a minute before this about kind of what we wanted to, the points that we thought were important and why we got into coffee. And I think we've already kind of touched on two of them. One is that human interaction part of it. Yeah. And the other one is the craft of it and how, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like wine or high-end beer or anything like that, where tasting it side by side is such an important part. And like, it is a journey in kind of how you experience coffee. Yeah. The way that you start in coffee is not the way that you finish in coffee. And what we're drinking today, I mean, this Nomad blend is so very different than that first. I think it was a vanilla latte that I had at Starbucks, but yeah, it's like, it's been a journey. And so there's really three parts I think that we're going to touch on today. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one. So, so tell me a little bit about why you got into coffee at the place that you got into it.
Yeah. I got into coffee. I don't know. A lot of times I think of getting into it backwards. So I did a lot of other things in life, lots of other jobs, but I really craved the human interaction. And I wanted to do that in a way that was what I thought simple, easy, and not as complicated as some of the other things that I'd done in life up to that point. It was something that I felt was an easy on-road because a lot of people drink it and people seem to enjoy it. And that seemed to be a nice space to get into. So when I started thinking about getting into that space, I kind of had this desire to start my own business, which we talked about before, coming from a very entrepreneurial-minded family. And I thought, it would be nice to open up a coffee shop, because that seems to touch all the different things that I want and I like in life. But I knew I didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge. So for me, it was this idea of, do I start one and then figure it out? Or do I learn about coffee and then figure out how to start one?
So I met you at Ceremony at your first coffee job, right? Like where it became a profession. What drew you to that place as opposed to maybe the green logoed place or somewhere else?
You know what? It's interesting. I think I applied for Starbucks.
Oh, they turned you down?
No, I think I got confused about the application process of had something to do with like you apply and then there were several stores that they could potentially use you for, which wasn't really my jam. I liked like aiming at one specific one. But I really wanted to learn as much as I could about the craft and the art of coffee. Right. And I knew from having been a customer there and kind of what I wanted to do, I needed a strong education. And so I took a look at all the different shops and their training programs, and I was really underwhelmed by a lot of different places. And I thought, Ceremony seems to have a really good, plan of training. And that would be a good place for me to get all the education I needed in one spot. Right. On top of that, I knew working in a shop would be far better than like going to some sort of coffee school or SCA classes or whatever. And I thought, well, if I can get it for free by
Right.
working there, that's way better than paying for it.
Yeah.
And so I decided, okay, this seems to be the sort of place that I want to be. I want to learn as much as I can before I figure out what I'm going to do next. And so I applied, if you want to call it that. I was a little bit crafty, I guess, in that application process of knowing I really wanted to have this job. And so I was really dedicated to it. And I remember the day of my interview, I woke up and I was talking to my wife and she was like, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "No, I'm not nervous because I'm going to get this job. I don't care what I have to do. I'm going to get this job." And then I got the job. And that's when, for me, I started to learn so much about, I wanted to know everything. Absolutely everything. I wanted to know about the numbers. I wanted to know about the process. I wanted to know about customers, everything. And so I knew, like, I want to start at the bottom and I want to learn absolutely everything there is to know about coffee shops and coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you jumped into the deep end, like going from not having worked professionally in coffee to working at Ceremony. I can't think of a more difficult way to do it. My experience, my experience in coffee was so much more drawn out. And in 2001, it was a different time in coffee. First of all, there were very few coffee shops. It just wasn't a thing it wasn't on every street corner like it is today.
Yeah.
Luckily, the college I went to had a coffee shop on the campus, and that's where I got a job. It wasn't at the Big Green Monster. I haven't actually ever worked there. Worked at other pretty decent sized chains, but this is just a little tiny independent shop, and the way that they did things are so different than the way that I would ever think about doing things now.
Yeah.
But part of that is, like, the industry grew over the last 19 years. Yeah. And so I was on the slow boat, and you took the jet right into ground zero. So yeah, we definitely came at getting into coffee from very, very different, like, perspectives, but we ended up at the same place. Yeah. And I think craft is such an important part of how we both ended up here.
Yeah, I think that, by the time that we met and we're working in coffee, we were very into the details, right? Of, like, how do you do this really well? Right. And I'm sure that helped us figure out, like, oh, maybe there's a future in this industry and what we want to do. And, like, really getting into the nitty gritty of it and saying, like, oh, does this particular detail matter? And if so, how does it matter? And then what does it do? Right. Which I think is really different than maybe how somebody who's just looking for a job takes a look at it. We were very, very detailed with, like, okay, let's take this variable, let's tweak it and see what kind of thing comes out of this. And there's just so many variables to do that with. And I think I know for us, it's what turns coffee shops, or maybe, starting with that one, into more like a science lab. Yeah. Which I think was really intriguing for a lot of customers. Yeah. Where they were saying, like, you all seem to be really focusing on this detail or that detail and trying to tweak it. And then they took interest in that. Yeah. Maybe for them, it wasn't even that the coffee tasted different in the end, but they were definitely fascinated by people who were fascinated by it. Right. And so we just continued tweaking those craft pieces of it and treating it, I don't know, like an art. Yeah. Yeah, very much in the same way that a Michelin star chef or a wine guru, wine sommelier would treat their craft is how we got to treat coffee. And I think that was, it was super fascinating. And I think where we're at in the coffee industry in general is super fascinating because we're still able to experiment and find out new things. And it's not like, I think about wine, it's been around for so long. It's such, like, steeped in history, like the practices are set in stone. There's not a lot of experimentation. Yeah. And we get to kind of help guide and create and build the coffee industry. Yeah. And that craft part of it it's amazing. It's amazing to be a part of that. It's amazing to constantly have something new to learn about coffee as things are being discovered. And there's all kinds of great blogs and
and articles that are being written all the time,
books and YouTube videos.
Yeah,
I know for me, that's where I went, because I chose to be obsessed by it inside and outside of work, and constantly reading and watching things to try to learn how deep does this go? And it goes very deep.
Very deep.
Very deep. And that was really fascinating for me, taking a look at water or growing coffee, roasting coffee, brewing it, like all those different pieces that can give you a substantially different outcome.
Right.
And so I remember in the beginning tasting a lot of coffee and trying to understand the sometimes subtle differences between one and the other.
Right.
And I think that really helped when you're looking at it that deeply. It really helped me to not mask the flavors with any sort of additions, but to say like, okay, what is this supposed to taste like?
Right.
And like, how did the Q grader roaster find these notes? Because if it's supposed to have these notes, I want to find these notes, because I don't think I speak this kind of language, but digging in deep and tasting and thinking about just became part of the craft, and really digging in. But I will say the thing that gave me a whole lot of confidence to really think that this was a thing for me was the first competition that I was in, which was that triangulation cupping, where there were the 3 cups and you have to pick out the one that's different. And it
got harder and harder.
Yeah.
It's a fun competition.
I thought it was a lot of fun. And, it's unlike anything else that I had ever done before, where you're tasting 3 cups of coffee. You don't know anything about them. You're just supposed to pick out the one that's different from the other 2.
Yeah.
And, it was just a fascinating thing of I don't know. I think about Gordon Ramsay and everything he says to his chefs about a really great chef has a really amazing palate and they can tell the differences between things.
Right.
And I thought, wow, this is very similar to that, because you're trying to distinguish these notes and you can't see it. Sometimes you can't even smell it. You just have to be able to feel it. And
And so, quick primer on how that competition works for non-coffee folks. I know when I first heard about these sort of things, my mind was blown that this got turned into a competition. But it's a triangulation. There's 3 different cups of coffee in front of you, and at the first rounds, they're very different. So you'll have 2 coffees from, let's say, 2 unwashed Ethiopians, which are insanely fruity, and then a washed Colombian, which couldn't taste any more different.
Right.
So round 1 is going to be fairly easy. Anybody that has tasted coffee for at least a couple of times is probably going to get that right. But then it gets harder and harder, and so you'll have 2 natural Ethiopians that are super fruity, and then a washed Ethiopian, which is far more muted and clean, and not as just much of a fruit bomb. And it gets more and more specific until finally in the later rounds, you've got 2 coffees from 1 plot of land on this farm in Ethiopia and 1 coffee from a higher up altitude plot of land on the same farm. So it gets progressively harder, and you're looking for tinier and tinier details in what makes that coffee stand out from the other 2.
Not to mention it's timed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're doing it in real time with a whole bunch of other people at the same time. So there's a level of nerves. Yeah. There's definitely a level of second guessing your palate. Yeah. But things like that that's the epitome of what kept me in coffee all these years. Yeah, that was a huge confidence boost for me. I was new-ish into coffee. I'd only been working there a couple of months, but I decided to go for it and compete. And out of all the people who competed, I was the only one who had a perfect score. Yeah. And that turned some heads and it made some people really jealous. But for me, it was a really big boost of confidence of oh, maybe this is something that you can do. Maybe this is something I can have a knack for. And that really got me excited. Then I know for me was creating signature beverages. That was a huge piece that was exciting for me of, okay, so you can brew coffee. Right. Now, what else can you do with it? You can add milk, which gives us a whole bunch of things on our espresso menu. Right. You can add flavors, which are nice, but what else can you do? And how inventive and creative can you get?
and I'm a pretty creative person. And so I thought, let me just jump in and experiment and try some stuff out. And then I let some people try it, and then they liked it. And I thought, oh, this is pretty fun. Like once you start with like really solid craft and you can do that well, I think it's kind of like, I don't know, in sports, you got to learn the basics before you can learn the more advanced things. And then that for me was just, it was kind of like I don't know. I like to think of it as a turning point where you go from like, okay, you can do a decent job working in a shop to now you can get super creative and the sky's the limit.
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of adding the culinary piece into the craft coffee piece.
Yeah. What about you? What about craft, and how did that develop for you over time?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely, I really like the technical aspects. So I've always been into cars and machines and things with engines, and so as I learned more about coffee and working in this college shop, they had a machine that was terrible. I mean, back then, most machines were terrible. La Marzocco was the only company I knew of that had a dual boiler machine. And the shop I was at did not use La Marzocco. We had like a really old 50s kind of technology heat exchanger machine, and it required so much tweaking. And so it went down one time, and I was somehow pulled the short straw in trying to make it work again. And so I got to take it all apart and see how it worked. And so that kind of technical aspect and learning about how to get consistent temperatures and how not having a consistent temperature will affect the shot. That was the thing that was really interesting and kind of sucked me in. And so I've always had kind of a technical bent when it comes to the coffee stuff. And so things like at Ceremony, where we worked before this, a lot of the things I really pushed hard for, like the mod bar pour over setup. Yeah. And that was one of those things that you have all of this control because it's such a finely tuned machine to make those little tweaks in water temperature or water volume or different spray head configurations and all kinds of stuff. That part of the craft was super interesting to me. As you probably know, I don't like to compete, not one to be on the competition stage. But man, if that machine breaks, I'll get in there and figure it out. And so it was definitely more of a technical side of things that sucked me into the coffee world.
And it's pretty interesting how the espresso machines of 19 years ago are like, I don't know.
They're Stone Age.
Yeah, they're like Model
so
Ts
different
compared to Maseratis and Lamborghinis of now.
Right.
Just with all the different aspects and things that you can program and control and manipulate in order to give you that perfect brew. Yeah.
I mean, things that are on machines now that are just so like every machine has them. I think about PID controls.
Yeah.
It's a little computer controlled box that gives you really consistent temperatures. I remember when people were on chat rooms, this is really throwing it back there, talking about like modifying their home machines with these PID controllers and how much better how much more consistent temperatures you got out of it. And then machine manufacturers started taking notice and putting them on bigger machines. So like I got to kind of watch that whole thing happen in real time while I'm in the industry. And I remember getting the kit from espressoparts.com and modifying our La Marzocco Linea to have PID controls because no machines came with those.
Wow.
So yeah, it's definitely been an experience kind of being a part of watching the industry grow. And I mean, it's the craft in coffee has exploded and has gone so crazy in the last 20 years. It's almost unrecognizable.
I think it's interesting how you can look at like a super simple home machine, like a DeLonghi, with like its really simple controls. And then you can look at like a decent espresso, like DE1 Pro, where it's all PID, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's gonna be tricky to figure that out. It's not a push button anymore. It's gonna be all computers and all these technical aspects of things that really change the game. But ultimately, what's interesting is it's still coffee.
Yeah.
And
it's not going to save you. The technology isn't going to save you. If you don't understand the concepts behind what's going to brew that good cup of coffee, all the technology in the world isn't going to do it for you.
Yeah. So for me, I like to think of the education and instruction like learning to drive a manual as opposed to an automatic.
Right.
It's not that driving an automatic is bad, but once you learn to drive manual, you can learn a whole bunch of other things that you can do that you wouldn't have otherwise known about.
Right.
And so I think that level of craft and skill has contributed greatly into what we are now.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's fascinating how we might go out on like a sales call or whatever. I remember one camp that we went to and they were talking about their espresso machine, and it was in rough shape. And it was interesting to be having a conversation with them about coffee and about what we could do, what we could help them with, while I'm actively fixing their machine and dialing it in and, changing up different things so that way they got a better shot out of it. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, part of me was pretty nervous, but on the other hand, it was, I know how to do these things and I can do them, and I can be even distracted by the conversation while fixing this. And then it wrapped up really beautifully because I finished fixing it. I pulled them a shot. I poured them some really great latte art, and they were just like really amazed that their equipment could do that.
Right.
And I thought, well, if I hadn't ever learned the manual way of doing this, I certainly wouldn't be able to do this.
Yeah.
So it was great.
Yeah. The craft is amazing. I think there's a flip side of that coin, which is why I think that you and I have worked really well together. And that's the kind of the human interaction part.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you get baristas that are infatuated with the craft and forget that there's a customer that you're about to hand that drink to.
Yeah.
So what part of the human interaction part brought you into coffee?
I like people, and I wanted to figure out, like, one of my big goals was to figure out a way to bring some love to the world. That was a big driver for me to get into coffee. And I saw people, they make their regular habit of going to their local shop, and they know their barista and they know what they like. And so I think for me, I wanted to be in that area of getting to know people and being part of their regular routine and rhythm. It's not even that I think like I have a lot to bring. I guess I'm a nice person. I have a darling personality. But being part of that and being in that space seemed very attractive to me.
Yeah.
And so what I found was, one, it wasn't anything like what I thought it was going to be, because there's nothing like trying to get to know somebody where you have a massive line and then somebody's complaining to you because their coffee wasn't great, right? But also it gives you some moments where things are slow that you get to know people that you wouldn't have otherwise, maybe you wouldn't have otherwise gotten to know.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it's interesting when you're opening a shop early in the morning. And I think it's one of those things that maybe a lot of people don't think about. Like, a barista wakes up and goes to work and they haven't had a chance to have their coffee yet.
Right.
But you're interacting with a lot of other people who haven't had their coffee yet.
Right.
But that's the life you choose.
Yeah.
So you pound coffee first thing and you try to wake up enough to be able to help other people get their first cup. And then consistency. Being consistently there for people and doing your best to bring a positive experience to them led to some interesting conversations and open doors.
Yeah.
People who come in regularly and you learn a little bit about their life. I remember I met one person at ceremony. She was a public defender, and she came in every day. Sometimes she would tie her dog up outside and then she would come in, and we just got into some conversations about, like, what does her day look like? And, what is she looking forward to? And then she would just begin to share. And then those conversations just continued. And to the point where she was like, oh, I had a case yesterday. It didn't go well. And it just, I don't know, it breaks the mold a little bit about like getting to know people through that consistent interaction with them. And it starts with something so small, like, coffee and a croissant, and it leads to, friendships and conversations and, touching base with people outside of work because you get to know them. Right. That's really, really special. I don't know. I guess there's other industries where that happens, but for that to happen in a coffee shop is really big.
Yeah. And I've had conversations with, I think probably the closest industry that is often similar is like the bartending world. I've had conversations with bartenders that their biggest frustration is so often their interactions are based around the negative, and it's people drowning their sorrows and maybe just trying to get over a rough day. Whereas in our industry, we get to set people off on the right foot.
Yeah.
We get to have the positive interaction. We get to have the coherent conversation. Yeah. And for the most part, those people that are out getting coffee, we talk about fueling the hustle, and that's kind of where that comes from. We get to kind of help people have a productive day.
Yeah.
Whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, we get to be part of that positive thing. And I think that's my favorite part, especially in how it differs from the bartending world, is we get to the opportunity to set people's day off on the right foot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think what we've really tried to work on here at Vagrant is we want to be able to balance that craft side, those insanely nerdy folks that get coffee so perfect, but we also want to have the other side of that. And that's that human interaction side.
Yeah.
And creating those connections and having those meaningful conversations. And it's a challenge to find people that are interested in both.
Yeah.
Because
yes,
that's not necessarily a personality that people tend to be one or the other. They tend to be either very technical or very personable.
Yeah. And I think it's also like a myth that people who work in coffee are morning people. Oh, I don't know a single morning person. I mean, maybe one who works for us who's an actual morning person.
Right.
We're not morning people, but I think
we just have a lot of coffee.
We want to interact with people,
right.
And we want to help people accomplish their goals. We want to, fuel their hustle. We want to set them off on the right path.
Yeah.
And we get to do that in a way that is kind of different and unique.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that everybody who comes in, wants to have a long conversation.
Right.
We have tons of people who just come in, they don't even say hello. They just walk in, they say large coffee,
right.
And they throw some money at us and then they walk away. And I think though, for us, that's kind of a, sad thing of obviously you're having a rough start and right. I want to be able to help you succeed in whatever it is you have going on. Yeah. And I know coffee will do that, but it's a little tough sometimes when people don't value that human interaction.
Right.
Which is, I think, an interesting piece of coffee that, plays a big role. The history of coffee and coffee shops being these public places where people right. can gather, I think is really special.
Yeah.
I think having that opportunity when maybe you don't have it anywhere else can be really, really meaningful. And that's right. probably why coffee shops have been around for so long, while we are able to continue operating even in the midst of pandemics.
Right.
These are things that people want. They want to be able to interact with other people.
Right.
But the game is changing for the future.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
It's, getting commoditized and it's shifting. And I think that's a big piece of the challenge that's ahead. I know that we put a lot of emphasis on how we source coffee and how do we give appropriate equity to the people who are doing the growing or the processing.
Right.
And, then you have other places that are, gas stations, McDonald's, whatever, who are just pumping out so many large quantities of this stuff that it changes a little bit of that interaction.
Yeah.
And so I think that really is a challenge for us going forward. How do we handle this with the growing landscape and the changing of the way people do things?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of pieces to that. A lot of pieces we've been wrestling. I mean, for this pandemic situation, as we're supposed to be limiting human interaction, which at a coffee shop is hard to do.
Yeah.
We installed these self-order kiosks.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges that we've had with those, while they're fantastic and it's really been helpful for us, is how do we have something like that available but not lose the human interaction?
Yeah.
And how can our baristas be making drinks and still interacting with people, even if we're not handing money across the counter?
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of challenges. And I think as technology continues to evolve and we have to decide what parts of technology we can embrace, how we can do that without losing that human interaction part.
Yeah. I agree.
It's a challenging question to grapple with.
I think that people still want to gather. People still want to meet new people and have interactions, maybe some schools of thought that are unique outside of their own personal experience. And I think coffee shops will continue to be those avenues. I mean, where else are you going to go to interact with people who you don't know and hear some thought about their life, their experience, their take on something? That's sometimes a little bit harder to find.
Right.
Now, of course, as technology evolves, there's a lot of that going on through things like podcasts, through video, that sort of thing. But I think that in-person valuing human interaction is a really big piece that we shouldn't, as a society, get rid of, in my opinion. It serves its purpose really well, as long as you can figure out how to make it relevant and how to keep it going with the technological advancement over time. So that's
it's an exciting thing for us as industry folks, because we know there is a future, even though technology is constantly changing. We were talking about this earlier today. Things like Instagram aren't going to be around in 100 years.
Right.
Who knows what will replace that? Coffee shops probably will be. Right. People will still be gathering and drinking coffee in some way, shape, or form. 100
years ago, people were sitting in a coffee shop reading the newspaper.
Right.
And now people are sitting in a coffee shop reading whatever news on a tablet or listening to it or watching a video. It still happens.
Right.
Maybe not as much mixed conversation as there once was. You can't go and hear a debate between two scholars in your local coffee shop.
Although we should bring that back.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. Maybe we can think about that. But people still go to them. People still sit. It is kind of weird and creepy now to see somebody sitting in a coffee shop without a phone or a tablet or a book and just sitting there. It's like, do you need help, or do you want to borrow my phone? But I feel like that is still an opportunity for that. You can still see people gathering. You can see friends gathering. You can see business meetings happening. And that's really, really special. So I like to be like involved in that. I don't necessarily feel like I need to be in the conversation or leading some sort of talk about something, but to be able to see other people have a space for that, I think is really, really meaningful.
Yeah. So that's two of our things: craft and human interaction. I think the third thing that got us into coffee originally and has kept us in coffee is the whole thing about origin and how we are connected to a bigger ecosystem within the coffee world, which is the farmers at the growing end. And so we kind of we get to kind of be this common thread that's tied around the entire world of people, so many hands that are involved in getting that customer their drink. There's so many hands required to make that product happen.
I think oftentimes growers get the short end of the stick.
Right.
And coffee is grown around the equator at high altitudes. And history has shown people in those kind of areas are like hard workers producing lots of goods for people who live elsewhere. Right. And they've often been exploited or taken advantage of. And that's made it to be quite challenging. And that's something that we care about a lot, I know. How do we give equity to people in those spaces? How do we give them a fair wage and make sure they're not living in abject poverty? Just so that we can sit back with our, lattes with all sorts of flavorings and just enjoy it. But making that a little bit more equitable and trying to highlight that a little bit for your average customer. I mean, it's really difficult to highlight, this is what the grower in this particular region of Rwanda is experiencing when you just want to come in, you want your large coffee and you want to walk out because you got things to do. But that's another challenge for us to say, like, no, their life and their experience and their work plays a huge role in how all this works.
Yep.
And we want to highlight that. We want to do our part. Whether or not people want to interact with it, we still want to do our part.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the amazing things that the craft coffee world has done for coffee farmers is pre 20 or 30 years ago, coffee was very difficult for a coffee farmer to make a living growing coffee.
Yeah.
And with the rise of the craft, it's gotten to a point where it's now worthwhile for coffee farmers to use however many acres of their property to grow really well cared for coffees.
It's got to be hard when everything is that, industrialization of just produce, or need more and more and more, create, more efficient farms. So that way you're getting crops that just churn out the same thing at mass quantities.
Right.
To now where you have, small lots where a farmer is able to carefully curate this particular plant so that way it grows in more comfortable conditions. But that's going to change a couple things. It's going to change like whether or not a crop makes it. Yep. And that means a lot for a farmer if their crop doesn't make it. And it's going to change how much it costs because time and effort cost.
Yep.
And that I think is often a confusing piece for a lot of people. I know I get asked the question all the time, like, why should I buy coffee from you? Because it's at this price when I can go over here and pay this price for it. And it's like, well, it's not just, it's not a capitalistic, like we just want to make all the money in the world. It's, well, this farmer deserves equity and we want to honor that. And all the other people, the processors, the importers and exporters and everybody else deserves equity. And that means that this is going to cost something. And I think that's just a piece that a lot of people don't factor in.
Yeah. And it's cool that we have the opportunity to kind of tell that story a little bit. It's one of the things that I always wish we could do a better job at. And we're always working on better ways to do that. But being able to have that story from the farm all the way to the customer and say, okay, we're gonna give you the cup of coffee and also tell you the story of how you got that cup of coffee. And it's not every interaction at the counter, but if we can make that story available to our customers or anybody else that's interested, like that's the idea. Yeah.
I know that our thought has been to go and meet our growers and share some of their stories and catch some video and be able to share that. And we also have to balance that with like work and trying to run the company. And so it's not like we can just go whenever. It's a lot to take a 3-day trip to a different country and capture a lot of video and still run everything that needs to be ran. So I know it's a big want of ours to be able to share that in a way that's going to touch people in a positive way and help them understand like, oh, this is something that really matters and there's people involved even though they're not close and we don't see them. That would be something that would be really meaningful for us to be able to share and see people like actually learn a bit.
And I think it's meaningful not only for our customers but also for the farmers, like for them to be able to see that what they are spending all of their time and effort growing, people are enjoying, and it's being handled well, it's being brewed well, it's and at the end of the day, there's a customer walking out the door about to have a fantastic day with a delicious cup of Ugandan coffee. So being able to tell the story both ways, we kind of get to be that intermediate person that gets to see both ends of the spectrum. And I think that it's pretty awesome to be in that place in the coffee chain.
So what do you think if we could narrow it down to maybe one or two things that we would want our customers or people who are interested in coffee to know about Origin? Like, where's a good place to start?
That's a fantastic question. I think you can ask a lot of questions at your coffee shop. Baristas love it a lot more than you would imagine that they love it. I mean, for the most part, we're all big coffee nerds and we want to just talk about coffee all the time. And a lot of times they're going to have some fantastic answers, and they can kind of help you explore the world through the coffee that you're drinking. I think there's some fantastic books out there. James Hoffman has a really good book about kind of the origin and where coffee's grown. I think there's so many different places to learn. Hopefully on this podcast, we're going to get a lot more into some of those things. We need to get Maria on here is what we need to do.
Yeah.
Maria is our roaster. She's super knowledgeable about origin stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we will do a whole segment about just origins.
Yeah.
So that way we can kind of highlight how it works and what her perspective is, both as a roaster, but also a Q grader, and being able to see quality of coffee and how do you help a roaster improve their quality, which I think that's got to be tricky also for a roaster. If you're used to mass production and now you're trying to do some micro lot and trying to curate something, like how do you do that well? I know, like, we get a lot of questions about, like, oh, is your coffee fair trade, or is it organic, or is it, whatever? And I think, I don't know, sometimes I think that those are tricky things to answer because of several factors, like people being taken advantage of, or people not being able to purchase the right documentation so that way they can say that their coffee meets these standards, because those are very real things. And I know that sometimes it's hard to get the question of, like, oh, is your coffee organic? And, like, what is the answer to that? Like, are you looking for the sticker, or are you looking for the practices? And like, how does that work? And do you trust it? Those are things that are they're much harder for growers to do than I think a lot of people know.
Yeah, it's so much more nuanced than I think people realize so often. And even things like fair trade. I always tell people it's fairly traded. Yeah. We're spending good money on the good coffee. And that's kind of the distinction that we want to make. Even if a farmer doesn't necessarily have the ability to go pay for that certification, because it is a certification that the farmer has to pay for. Even if that's not the case, if their coffee is at the quality level that we're looking to purchase, we'll pay above what that fair trade guaranteed price is. So a lot of those things, just aren't known outside of the coffee industry. But a lot of baristas do know these things. And so that's, if you get an opportunity to have a chat with your barista next time you come into a coffee shop, that's a great place to start. Yeah.
So I guess in I don't know, combining it all together, this is of course why we got into coffee, but then also like how we want our coffee to be. I think that is a huge driver for us to say, like, no, we're committed to making sure there's human interaction. We're committed to the craft and skill, and we're committed to making sure there's like that shared equity and trusting the process of what's going on with our growers and our origin situation. That all of that combined is such a big piece. And I feel like oftentimes you get the question of, like, well, what's different about your coffee? And I can go to the gas station, I can get coffee, and I can go to you and get coffee. What's different about yours? Is it going to taste better? Is it going to blow my mind? And it's like, well, it might not. It might not. Maybe you like tons of cream and sugar and you're not going to be able to taste the difference anyway. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other factors that go into it. I like how you said, though, that it's like fine wine or really craft high-end things. And I think it's a lot like restaurants, where you have your really fancy restaurants where you can expect to pay more for better ingredients and those sort of things. But it's still complicated, I think, in some people's minds when it comes to coffee. They're thinking, oh, it's just coffee. How hard can it be? And it's like, well, it can actually be quite hard.
I think, I think more and more people in the U.S., the coffee drinkers, are realizing that there's a craft behind brewing coffee. And as an industry, we need to get better about telling the story of the craft behind growing coffee. And if we can kind of make that connection, and say, yeah, we're committed to brewing the best coffee possible. But at the same time, we're also committed to buying the best green coffee and roasting it the best way possible. Like every piece in that supply chain is so critically important.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't just leave one of those pieces out.
Yeah. I wish that there was a way that that was something that people knew.
Yeah, we'll work on it.
Yeah. But until then, we're going to keep on keeping on, trying to do our best to make great coffee and tell our story of everything we've learned on this entrepreneurial journey, which has been a lot. We're not done learning yet, but we've learned a whole lot, and I think that we're enjoying really sharing it. But at the same time, I'm really interested in hearing other people's journey and understanding of not only coffee, if that's what people are into. I love those stories, but also with their businesses. Yeah, for sure. As you get into whatever it is that you're into, I'm sure you learn things along the way, and I am sure that those things may have been new or confusing or eye-opening, and those stories, I think, are really what drive us to do really great work and really apply ourselves and make something new and make something exciting. So if you have some thoughts, if you have your particular journey, drop it in the comments or share.
Tell us the things that you wish people knew about your industry. I think we'd be interested in hearing that.
I think that would be fascinating. The things that you wish people knew about your industry. Because we love to share with you ours. Because that's some weighty and good stuff. That would be great. I would love to read those stories. Well, I guess then that kind of explains why coffee. And us. And I guess we'll connect with you next time about some other things that we've learned on this entrepreneurial journey.
Thanks for joining us.
See you soon.
Bye. Hey everybody, it's Josh and Jared with the Vagrant Coffee HustleCast.
Tune in every Tuesday for new content at vagrantcoffee.com.
Please like, share, and subscribe.
Drink Vagrant Coffee.
And keep hustling.